So welcome to the first chapter in our book, Introduction to Law and Legal Systems. You can see the learning objectives there on the screen. You're not dumb, so I won't read them to you. I will just sort of move ahead with this discussion. And my first question for you is, where does law come from? I know, you know. No, I'm not going to sing the psych intro song, but I know that you know that laws come from lawmakers, legislators, people who propose laws and then vote on those laws, and then the president signs them into order or into existence if they're federal laws, and the governor signs them in if they're state laws. And that's true. That's where laws come from. But I'm speaking of a more, I guess, a more theoretical or philosophical sense. Where does law come from? Imagine if we were a community of people, the people in this class, we all live together in a little community. We didn't have any laws or any rules, but we lived together in harmony because everybody respected everyone else's stuff, and of course their autonomy individually, and everything was quite happy. And one day, Riley is walking down the road, and he's walking past Jill's cabbage patch. Not the dance, an actual patch of cabbages. And he thinks, man, those cabbages look delicious. I would love to have one of those cabbages. So Riley walks over, takes out his pocket knife, and takes one of Jill's cabbages. And then he walks on down the road, and Jill comes out of her house and says, hey, that's my cabbage. And Riley says, I know, it's delicious. Thank you. And she says, but I didn't say you could have it. And he says, well, you can't be selfish. We all live together in this community. So Jill feels powerless because these cabbages she had made and, well, grown. She didn't make them. I don't think she has those skills. But those cabbages, she's put all the work and effort into growing and planned to eat them herself or have them as food for her family. Now she has less cabbage, and she's frustrated by that. But she doesn't really have any recourse. So we call together a town meeting. And at the town meeting, Jill kind of says her concerns, and Riley says his. And as a town, we all agree that you can't take cabbages out of anybody else's cabbage patch. And we all go our separate ways. And the next day, Riley's walking down the street and thinks, man, I could really go for another one of those delicious cabbages. And he walks over to Jill's garden and takes another cabbage. And Jill comes out and says, hey, we made a rule. We made a law. You can't take a cabbage. And so Riley says, well, yeah, I don't really believe in that law. And he keeps on going. And again, there's nothing Jill can do. So Jill calls together a town meeting, and we all come together, and we all say, well, what are we going to do about this? So we agree to affix a punishment. If you steal a cabbage from someone's garden, then you're going to be locked up on the shack on the edge of town for a whole month. And then, because we're smarter this time and we realize we can't just make that rule without having some way of enforcing it, we all get together and we hire Tim. We agree that we'll each pay something out of our garden to Tim each month, in exchange for which he'll stop gardening and he'll be our sheriff. So Tim's job will be to enforce the laws we've made, and he'll get paid, or he'll get some other sort of compensation from the community for doing that. So the next time Riley takes a cabbage, Tim comes along and takes Riley and throws him in the shack out on the edge of town, and he has to stay there for a month. So now we've got a fledgling little government going, right? We don't have a legislative branch yet because there's so few of us, we're acting as our own legislators. But as the town grows, it might be really hard if we had 50,000 of us for us all to get together every time we want to make a new rule. So instead, what we'll do is we'll elect representatives, someone to represent each neighborhood in our town. We do have an executive branch, someone whose job it is to enforce the rules or laws we make and later our legislature will make, well, when we get big enough to have a legislature. And the only thing we're lacking is a judicial branch, which we're probably going to need right off the bat because, you know, maybe Riley, when he comes and takes the cabbage and then he gets arrested, he says, wait a minute, I didn't use my knife this time. Instead, I just ripped it out of the ground, roots and all, and that's not the same as harvesting it. And the law says you can't harvest someone else's cabbage, or who knows what he argues. So now we have to find somebody, we'll get together and we'll hire somebody who can look at our laws and look at the challenges to our laws and say, what was the intent of this law? Was the intent that you only don't cut them out of the ground with a knife, or was the intent that you wouldn't take stuff that belongs to other people and then make a ruling on that? And then we'd have a judicial branch. So this is where law comes from, right? By a society of people living together who say we need certain rules to govern the behavior that's acceptable in our society. Of course, one of the challenges with that is we don't always all agree on what behavior is acceptable, right? Our country can't even agree on who should be allowed to come into the country or go out of the country at will. We can't agree on who should be allowed to be married or not be married. We can't agree on what constitutes an acceptable lie or not an acceptable lie. And so this becomes very troublesome and very confusing at times. So in its oldest sense, there are kind of two grand categories of legal thinking. There's more than these two, okay? But these are like the two most influential on our current state of thought or thinking about law. One is called positivism, and the other is called natural law. Positivism says law comes from the command of whoever's in charge, the sovereign, meaning the king, or maybe in the case of a place like the United States, the president and the legislature. The legislature makes the laws and the president enforces them, and because they made the law and they were signed into law by the president, then we recognize that command as legitimate. It doesn't matter if the law is moral or immoral. What matters is it was the law made by the lawmaker. That's what legal positivism thinks. Of course, it's a little crazy, right? I don't think many of us would want to follow a law that we thought was immoral. But if we let everybody not follow laws because they don't like them or don't think they're moral, we would have chaos. So the other side of the equation is what's called natural law. And natural law is a law that's based on some universal moral order. Some people think of that as God, right? That God creates universal moral order, and then we're all sort of bound to follow those laws. Others would say, you know, well, it's not from God, or there is no God, or whatever other people say, right? They might say that this universal moral order just comes by virtue of it's always been there. Moral order existed before we did. And so because of this, they say people don't make laws. Instead, we discover the laws that are already there. And if some human power, a legislature, a king, makes a law that is not in keeping with these natural laws, these natural moral, or this universal moral order, then we're not bound to follow those laws. In fact, Thomas Jefferson, when he wrote the Declaration of Independence, he listed all of these rights that people have as unalienable, that came purely by their birth and came from some creator. And he said not only do the people not have an obligation to follow the laws that the King of England had made that were injurious to these natural laws, but not only did they not have to follow them, but they were duty bound to throw off such oppression. And so our country, the United States, has this dual history. On the one side, we tend to believe in the rule of law. We don't want anarchy, so we want to have rules. And we don't think that just because you don't like something, you can not follow the rules. But on the other side, we were founded by this notion of natural law, founded by this notion that we have a right, maybe even a duty, to fight against laws that are immoral. Don't we in this country hold up Rosa Parks, who famously refused to give up her seat on the bus, even though the law said she should? Don't we consider her a hero? So we live in a country that loves positivism, but we also love the natural law. So as I kind of just alluded to, in America, we have a system of positive law. Laws made by the legislature and approved by the president have authority, but we have a very strong undercurrent of natural law and natural law thinking. We admire and even extol conscientious objectors sometimes, and sometimes we hate them, right? Depends on if it's a law that we agree with or don't agree with. We have to recognize that law provides the moral minimums of society. In other words, the law doesn't necessarily agree with everything that each individual agrees with. Instead, the law tends to be those parts that we can all agree on. Our law comes from two main sources. There are others, but these are the two main sources. One is called the common law. That is law that comes from court precedents, so laws that weren't created by the legislature or by city councils, but instead, as judges rule on cases, we take those rulings and we review them each time a new case is heard, and judges will take those previous rulings as precedent to help decide their next ruling. So that's called common law, which is law based on judicial precedent. And the other type is statutory law. That's law that is created by legislatures. They're called statutes. Okay. In Arizona, they're called the Arizona Revised Statutes. Those are all the laws that were created by the Arizona State Legislature. We have civil law and criminal law. Civil law is when individuals or groups of individuals sue other individuals. In civil law, we consider that one person has harmed another in some way, either financially or maybe physically, and that individual has a right to sue the other person in civil law. Whereas in criminal law, we consider that is when somebody harms all of society, and now the government is prosecuting a person for breaking one of the statutory laws. And so those two types of law are different. Substantive law and procedural law. Substantive law is that law that deals with all the things I just mentioned, breaking statutes or harms against other people. And procedural law are those laws that govern the way the government is required to deal with individuals whenever the two have to have dealings. So the way the court has to run, that's guided by procedural laws. The way police officers have to read you Miranda rights before they arrest you, that is procedural law. So procedural laws have to do with how the government, what their limits are when dealing with citizens, versus substantive law, which is all the other sorts of laws. And finally, we have private law versus public law. Private law is that law that has dealings between individuals. Private law is created when people sign contracts and agree to certain things with one another. So when you got your cell phone from Verizon, you signed a Verizon contract. That contract represents a piece of private law between you and Verizon. And if either one of you break it, then it will become a case of civil law as you take it to court to be heard. Public law is the government versus individual citizens. Instead of citizen versus citizen. It's pretty much all the laws that you think of as laws that were created by government. as opposed to private law, which is just contracts and agreements between individuals. So this is just meant to be an overview. We will dig much more deeply into a lot of these concepts. Don't worry if you don't feel like an expert on law in America. I just wanted to hit some of the main topics in a quick way. So I mentioned before that most of our laws come from statutes and judicial decisions. But other sources of law, probably the most important source of law, is the Constitution. Each state has its own constitution, which spells out limitations of the government and sometimes other rules that people have to follow. The federal constitution, it spells out the limitations of the government, things the government cannot do. And then court precedent has later told us that certain individuals also can't break or violate the constitutional rights of others. Statutes, which I mentioned, which are laws passed by the legislatures, and treaties, which are also passed by legislatures. Agency regulations, which we'll talk a lot more about later, but agency regulations are those rules made by agencies, and the agencies themselves were created by the legislatures. Judicial decisions or common law, like I mentioned before, when a judge makes a ruling, then all the other judges sort of use that ruling as a precedent in making their own rulings. That Latin term I have on there, which is called stare decisis. No one knows for sure how to pronounce Latin words because, well, Latin's a dead language, but that's how most people pronounce it. That means let the decision stand. And so you'll sometimes hear that term as it relates to common law, which is judges should allow the decision to stand unless there's some reason to overturn it. And finally, executive orders. The President of the United States or the governor of a state can make orders. This is pretty controversial, but they can make orders that in essence have the rule of law. And we'll talk about it more later when we talk about our branches of government, why it's so controversial. Recognize that the Constitution of the United States is the supreme law of the land. So when the Supreme Court is judging whether or not any other law is acceptable, what they're supposed to do is compare it to what's stated in the US Constitution and then make a decision as to whether or not that law is constitutional or matches up with the intent of the Constitution. Recognize that the United States is different than some other countries. In the United States, we have what's called a common law system, where we do have statutes, but our statutes are often less detailed, leaving it up to the judges to decide what was intended in the statute. Countries like England, Canada, Australia have similar systems. Really, they all kind of branch out of the English common law system. If you look at that little list we have there, those are all countries that are closely related to England and were once part of England. So we worry a lot about legal precedent in the United States. Most of Europe and probably most other countries that have developed systems use a civil law system where the statutes are like really hyper detailed. And so the law is in the code, not in the cases. And then there's other systems like an Islamic legal system, what they call Sharia, where the law is sort of decided by religious leaders, or in socialist systems where the law is often just decided by various bureaucracies depending on the authority that's given to them. And so that really does it for an introduction to law. Hopefully it was valuable to you to just kind of have a basic overarching understanding of our legal system here in the US and our sources of law. We'll definitely go into more detail in a lot of these areas as we move through the course. I hope it will help you in your future as business people, but I also hope it will make you stronger and more informed citizens of our country.